The La Crosse Public Library Archives presents Dark La Crosse Stories, a series in collaboration with the La Crosse Tribune, featuring the seedier side of La Crosse, Wisconsin's history. These true stories are reflections of their time and place in history. The intent is not to diminish the human suffering that may have resulted from these events, but to bring light to ways in which people in the past experienced life. The city of La Crosse and the locations where these stories took place occupy part of a vast network of the ancestral lands of the Ho-Chunk, and we thank our Ho-Chunk community members and their ancestors for their stewardship of this area's land and history.
The sweet smell of lilacs and a stack of letters with pretty stationery adorned with dainty floral designs. Ah yes, these are signs of a woman in love. Unfortunately, these love letters were written to a married man who happened to be our former pastor. Juicy stories about former Reverend Hanson? Boy, have I got 'em for you. Whew. The paper said, this court case proved very exciting before the end was reached with its combination of a murdered cat and love letters. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The fair Reverend Martin Hanson came to the United States in 1891 from Norway to study for the pulpit and then accepted a call to a church in Houston, Minnesota, and was there for a while. Then our Norwegian Evangelical Church, Trinity Lutheran on La Crosse's north side, put out a call to him to lead our school, which he accepted. Everyone loved him. Then we hired him to be our preacher. He was a great speaker in the pulpit and looked dashing too, with his blue eyes, sonorous voice, and all dressed up in his black Prince Albert coat. But he had some trouble with a faction of people in the church. In January 1894, Hanson wrote a letter to the trustees resigning his position for violating the seventh commandment. You know, adultery. I'm sure he wouldn't have, except that one of our deacons found out that Hanson had illicit relations with a woman in St. Paul, and the trustee told us that she gave birth to his son just a couple of weeks before. So the trustees, of course, accepted his resignation.
In an odd move later that fall, perhaps because Hanson could no longer obtain a call to a church, he took Christian Drager, the Trinity Lutheran trustee, and Reverend Christopher Itcherhus, pastor of Bethel Lutheran Church, to court. He claimed slander charges, demanding $5,000 damages from each man. Testimony included a letter addressed to Hanson, but had been unintentionally opened by Itcherhus, his landlord at the time. Hanson claimed that upon reading this letter, Itcherhus told local people publicly, "All that has been said about Hanson and the woman in St. Paul is true. He had the same trouble in Norway and had to leave that country."
Turns out, our pastor was already accepting aid from the La Crosse County Poor Commissioner. He was broke. Hanson was an outcast. No one would take him as a pastor. So he decided to threaten our dear Mrs. Norm with extortion in 1897. That was a huge mistake. Back when Hanson first was hired in La Crosse, Mrs. Norm from our church was appalled that the young minister couldn't afford to bring his wife and children to the United States from Norway. So she wrote him a note for $200 to bring the rest of his family over here in 1894. The good Reverend didn't make any payments on that $200 note that Mrs. N lent him. She quietly let it expire and did not request him to repay the loan. Instead, she knew the fallen pastor was working as a piano salesman in town, so she decided to use the note as payment on a new piano. But she played it smart. Instead of giving the note over to Hanson, she sent it directly to the piano company's headquarters in Milwaukee as payment on a new piano. Oh, Hanson didn't like that at all, since it was now he who had to fork over that money to his employer. So he decided to take revenge on Mrs. N and probably all the other parishioners in our church. The man was always in debt and thought he was too good to work in blue-collar jobs. Hanson tried to work out a deal with a local attorney named Graves, telling him he could easily extort money out of Mrs. N by blackmailing her. Hanson used the improper relations accusation, thinking she would do anything to keep her name out of the papers and quell the drama. She was a young widow with some means, but she didn't squash anything. She tackled it head on. Graves knew Hanson's plan was probably not going to be successful. I mean, really. The man and the law went together as good as oil and water. Ha! So Graves blew the whistle on Hanson's scheme, and then the court case began. Mrs. N had no idea all the legal stuff she had to go through to convict this slippery eel. She was nervous and upset, having to navigate this all herself. Mrs. Johanna Hanson, the former Reverend's wife, was called as a character witness in the case by District Attorney Morris. She reluctantly testified that her husband treated her shamefully and came home late from tending bar one night in a rage, demanding that she cook him some supper. Listen to what the paper said when Mrs. Hanson testified. He came home between 10 and 11 o'clock, very angry, and ordered me to make some meal. I was afraid of him and wanted to get out of the house. He locked the doors while I was away and killed the cat in the house. The arguments to the jury lasted several hours, and in the course of them, many laughable incidents occurred.
Hanson saw the writing on the wall and admitted his guilt, which meant that any further testimony was called off. He was sentenced to pay a fine of $100 for extortion and serve 5 months in the county jail. After he completed his jail sentence in summer of 1898, Hanson left La Crosse and his family, heading to Minnesota to find work, he claimed. But Hanson never returned to join his family. By 1901, Mrs. Hanson had enough and brought suit against Hanson for desertion and non-support. He was arrested in Adrian, Minnesota, and was extradited to La Crosse. She claimed he hadn't sent more than $30 in 3 years to his family in La Crosse since he left.
Apparently, the former pastor had more than one lady friend in western Minnesota. On the stand for the charge of desertion, he denied knowing the sender of a stack of perfumed letters adorned with flowers. He even received them while he was in jail. The prosecuting attorney brought this to the court's attention, but the judge jokingly scoffed and smiled, saying, "Maybe they are business letters." Yeah, right. All the men in the courtroom snickered. It was obvious what Hanson was up to, and why he didn't come back or send any support to his family. In the letters, Hanson says he would get a divorce from his wife and marry this other woman. On the stand, Hanson denied knowing the women. Of course.
Hanson was found guilty of desertion, but received only a light sentence. The judge could have sent him to a pawn or enacted a more severe jail sentence, but Hanson had already served nearly 7 months behind bars. The court denied a new trial, and the newspaper said, quote, "He will be given the privilege of cracking macadam with the rest of the convicts, which will be the first he will have done since his arrest and extradition last June." It went on to say, quote, "It is understood that Reverend Hanson was not averse to taking a year at Waupun, which, if he served, would be equivalent to divorce. He is over-anxious to have his matrimonial bonds annulled."
While he was in jail, he, along with the other prisoners, would be ordered to do work outside of the jail grounds, such as raking and other yard work on county grounds. When meeting members of his former parish unexpectedly, he had to endure a lot of awkward humiliation. And then, while he was at the jail watering a horse that spring, he got kicked really bad and thrown into the air. He was knocked unconscious, but didn't break any bones. After he served his time, that was the last we saw or heard of former Reverend Hanson in La Crosse. As we hear in church, the way of the transgressor is hard.
Finally, in 1905, Mrs. Johanna Hanson was granted a divorce from her former minister husband by Judge Fruit for leaving her in a destitute state. But Hanson had already started a new life west of the Mississippi River without his family. Martin Hanson died in Bagley, Minnesota in 1911. His former wife, Johanna, continued to live in La Crosse until 1927 when she left to join a daughter and her family in Minneapolis. She died there sometime before 1940. And now I'd like to welcome in Anita Taylor-Doring, Senior Archivist and Archives Department Manager at the La Crosse Public Library, who did some of the initial research for this story.
The 1890s was a tumultuous time in La Crosse. While 5 railroads now came into the city to expedite bringing people and freight into and out of La Crosse, the backbone of the local economy, the lumber industry, was reaching its height, and already imminent depletion of this naturally occurring resource was in sight. Manufacturing in the area did not depend on this, but the lumber industry provided many unskilled jobs for the laboring classes. Non-English speaking immigrants, particularly Norwegians, were well suited for these unskilled lumbering jobs, both up north in the pineries felling trees or riding log rafts down the Black River in the spring or working in the sawmills during the summer months. Many Norwegian immigrants began coming to the Coulee region starting in the late 1860s, with a particularly heavy influx by the 1870s as immigrants disembarked at the steamboat landing. A settled Norwegian immigrant himself, Charles Solberg, prepared a safe place for newly landed Norwegians to get acclimated to the culture in La Crosse at that time. Many of the Norwegians wished to own land and be farmers. Immigrants tended to naturally frequent stores, churches, and schools where their native language was spoken and where they felt welcomed. This insular behavior helped to foster alliances and friendships and acted as a support system. By the time Reverend Martin Hanson and his family reached La Crosse, many of the Norwegian Americans had been living in the United States for 20 or more years, and their children may have known or spoken Norwegian, but also had a very solid grasp of the English language and American culture. Joanna Hanson, the wife of the fallen Reverend and a newly arrived immigrant herself, had to repeatedly go outside of her support circle to seek help from public welfare to support herself and her children when Hanson was away. During Hanson's trials, Joanna had an interpreter. Although the newspaper accounts mentioned there was more than one interpreter, at least one of these was a female friend from Trinity Lutheran Church to help her understand what was being said. Sometimes the interpreter would answer on Johanna's behalf, and sometimes Johanna would try answering herself in English. In the late 1880s, many of the American-born Wisconsin residents around the state began to call for laws to hold parochial schools more accountable to the government and to require the classes be conducted in the English language. The German Americans were particularly vocal in their distaste of the Bennett Law and felt targeted and discriminated against. In 1890, this controversial law and the governor who supported it were voted out of office after only one term. However, most immigrant groups began to naturally integrate the teaching of English in their schools, and eventually churches offered one service in the church's native language and a service in English. This is because the young people within those communities demanded it. Most of the church records from Norwegians and Germans began to use English before World War I, but this international event sped up the exclusive use of English, breaking down the cultural insulation of schools, churches, and neighborhoods. Stephen Aune, in his essay Gott, Gut or God, German and Norwegian Cultural Assimilation in La Crosse Churches, states that at the turn of the 20th century, Lutheran pastors made the association of keeping the Norwegian language alive at home and in prayer. In other words, the church was essential for Norwegian immigrants to maintain their morals and religion so far from the homeland through the use of their native language. However, this was beginning to change by 1905, when worship services in English began to be offered once a week by some congregations. By 1920, St. Paul's Lutheran Church on the south side voted to cut down the number of worship services in the Norwegian language to just once a month. Not only was there outside political and social pressure to assimilate, but the youth conversed in English and not the Norwegian of their parents or grandparents. By 1920, there were a few new congregations also vying for Norwegian Americans who spoke English or preferred services in the English language, namely the Evangelical Free and English Lutheran churches. For the sake of the congregation's future, it was a natural choice for many of the traditional churches to switch to English sooner than some of their traditional members preferred. By the 1950s, cultural assimilation was complete in the traditionally ethnic churches in La Crosse. At the height of the number of traditionally Norwegian language-based churches in 1900, only 3 of these 10 communities of faith continue to exist today. Aune's essay is freely available online from the Archives website. Thanks for listening.